I want to start by talking briefly about what I mean by social mobility and meritocracy, and say something about academic approaches to social mobility. The most influential theoretical approach to social mobility is John Goldthorpe and the Nuffield School's quantitative approach. And Goldsmith and his colleagues developed an approach for measuring relative as well as absolute social mobility. And absolute mobility measures the total number of people moving occupational class position, while relative mobility measures the relative chances of people from different class origins achieving particular occupational positions. And it's relative mobility rates that indicate the openness of society, with low rates indicating persistent and rigid social class structures. And the term's often used in conjunction with the term meritocracy. And a meritocratic system is a competition in which there are clear winners and losers, but in which the resulting inequalities are justified on the basis that participants have an equal opportunity to prove themselves. And the best known book on meritocracy is Michael Young's The Rise of the Meritocracy, written in 1958, where he argues that merit equals ability plus effort. But Young's intention was to parody not just the idea of meritocracy, but even that it could exist in deeply unequal societies. Yet over the last 50 years, meritocracy has been taken seriously by politicians and policymakers and raised to what I would call iconic status in British society. And attempts to realise it have been made by Conservative and Labour governments alike, but all have failed because Britain is too structurally unequal for more than a small percentage of hyper-competitive, super-focused, and above all, incredibly lucky members of the working classes to succeed. And it's no surprise that in those countries with the smallest gap between rich and poor, such as the Scandinavian countries, it's those countries that have the highest levels of social mobility and most approximate to meritocracy. And spending on state education also makes a difference. The OECD concluded that countries with the highest levels of state investment in state education had higher levels of social mobility than countries that invested less in their state educational system. And in more equal societies, it's easier to climb up, and the social penalties for slipping down are less severe. So here we can see in this slide that the inequalities in the UK are wide. In fact, you can see that the UK is an outlier in terms of the difference in GDP between the poorest and the richest groups in society. So we can see an enormous difference between inequalities in Britain and those in countries like Sweden. And those inequalities have actually worsened as a result of both Brexit and COVID. So here in the UK, we have a society with huge barriers to social mobility, unlike countries like Sweden that are much more equal. But I want to show you just how much social mobility there actually is in the UK, mapped against British people's perceptions of living in a meritocracy. And in the UK, there's still a strong belief in people's academic achievement being the result of their ability and effort, while the evidence shows that it's as much to do with the wealth and power of their parents. And here in this slide, we can see that rather than being a socially mobile society, we are really, as compared to other countries, socially immobile. And then if we look at how well working class children are doing educationally compared to those in other countries, we can see in this slide that the percentage of high achieving children in the poorest economic groups are doing really badly compared to countries like Canada, Japan, Australia, and Korea. And when Michael Young coined the term meritocracy in his satire, he introduced into popular understanding an ideal that was long cherished in British society, which is may the best person win. And the meritocratic ideal, if not the term itself, has become a cornerstone of liberal and social democratic thought over the last 2 centuries. And despite Young's pessimistic accounts of the dangers of meritocracy, it's become widely accepted as an ideal in liberal democratic societies, but particularly in the US and the UK. However, I want to argue that the very notion of merit as a source of advancement is intrinsically conservative. It undercuts any ideas of radical change or an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, and generates policy options that work within existing structures rather than challenging them. And I just want to, because I always do, bring in a quote from Bourdieu. And he saw neoliberalism as a program for destroying collective structures which may impede the pure market logic. And so meritocracy has become a key weapon in neoliberals' armory, the dominant ideology justifying neoliberals' central tenet of the winner takes all. And the British in particular subscribe to the fantasy of upper and middle class privilege as a meritocratic achievement. They're successful because of their ability and their effort. And this is despite, in the UK, as we've seen in the slide I showed you earlier, having one of the lowest levels of social mobility in the developed world. As a consequence, privilege is represented as advantage and status that the privileged had earned through hard work and ability, rather than through social, cultural, and economic benefits they amass but simply by being born into already privileged families. And the dishonesty of such a representation has been underscored by recent revelations that the examination reforms, particularly those instituted under COVID, are actually giving private school pupils an additional advantage in the competition for university places. And private school pupils already have a huge advantage over their state school counterparts. The latest research by Sol Gamsu shows that private schools have 3.7 times as much income per student as state schools have. They have far better resources than pupils have in the state sector, more advantageous teacher-pupil ratios. And this is social status being purchased, not earned. It's not equal opportunities, but what Michael Young describes in The Rise of the Meritocracy as equal or equitable. And in spite of the evidence, the fantasy in the UK is that everyone with enough determination, hard work, and talent can be whatever they want to be. And the primary vehicle for that transformation is our educational system. And in reality, far from diversifying our elites and transforming the chances of high achieving working class young people, the educational system in the UK is primarily reproductive, reinforcing the status quo and largely keeping people in the economic, social, and cultural positions into which they were born. In the very unequal society that the UK has become, meritocracy is the flimsy sticking plaster patching up a rotten public realm, a civil society that is no longer civil or even particularly social. Citizens, particularly in the UK, but also in the US and Australia, are convinced that poverty and wealth are the outcomes of a fair meritocratic process. They believe that just as the rich deserve their success, so the poor deserve their poverty. and they're hardened to growing levels of inequality because they increasingly live in class and racially segregated communities. The illusion exposed in The Rise of the Meritocracy is that education is supposed to be meritocratic, but throughout the history of state education, it has remained a powerful mechanism of legitimation of social closure and exclusion. It allows capitalist societies like the UK to maintain a system of firmly entrenched inequalities in which meritocracy operates as a key justification for social inequalities, a key linchpin in neoliberal ideology. And now every child has to reach for the sky, aim for the stars. It's no longer acceptable to want to work in a shop, be a building labourer or a care worker. These are the jobs you take on the way to fulfilling your dreams. Britain has become the aspiration nation, but aspirations need infrastructure if they're to be realised. And if you're working class and lack the power, wealth and resources of the middle and upper classes, that's an extremely difficult situation to find yourself in. Increasingly, the infrastructure is not there. But our aspirational society is made up of privileged people who want to give their children a better chance of having educational success than other people's children. But they also want to be seen to be being fair. And the main subterfuge for doing this is to collude in the myth that our educational system is meritocratic, when it's patently entrenching and rewarding wealth and advantage. As many academics, including Basil Bernstein and Pierre Bourdieu, have argued over the past 50 years, we should not be looking to the educational system to deliver a fairer society with equal opportunities for all to succeed. Schools alone cannot solve the problems of poverty and equal opportunities, but nor should they be expected to. So how does meritocracy position those few of us who are socially mobile from the working classes into professional jobs? The qualities and capabilities of the socially mobile are always framed within the discourse of self-efficacy, aspiration and choice. We are the agentic few among a large mass of working classes who are perceived to be passive, unintelligent and unmotivated. We are, according to the dominant dogma, the brightest and the best of the working classes, those whose ability and effort has shone through. But having lived a rags to riches trajectory from free school meal child, growing up on a Sink council estate, to becoming a Cambridge professor, I know what a callous and complacent fiction this is. Meritocracy and the preoccupation with social mobility that it encourages has been the undoing of the working classes in more ways than one. It positions the still working classes as too stupid, too idle to make the move forward towards becoming a better, brighter person. They become the outcasts in the UK aspiration dream story, and as such can be disregarded and mistreated by the more powerful in society. The symbolic violence of social mobility is that the working classes are only classified as of value if they adopt middle class dispositions of neoliberal competitive individualism. But for the few who do succeed, social mobility is a lonely, individualized process. Inevitably, you can only go up the ladder alone. As such, it works against solidarity, depleting the working classes of much needed human resources, and frequently estranging socially mobile individuals from the communities they've left behind without providing them with another one to belong to. And they often experience a sense of never fitting in. In this divisive meritocratic race to the top that the education system has become, the still working classes have become the pathologized other. I now want to talk about the consequences of meritocracy for those positioned as losers in the educational system. And this is Michael Young in his book. And he writes of the educational losers. They're tested again and again. And if they've been labelled dunce repeatedly, they cannot any longer pretend. Their image of themselves is more nearly a true, unflattering reflection. And I'm going to draw on ethnographic research I conducted in schools over what is now a 30-year period to illustrate the damage that such unflattering reflections inflict on working class learners. So this is Tracy, who's constantly dreaming about her SATs and doing well in them, but actually feels that ultimately she's never going to be able to fulfill her dreams, but then she's still hoping. And as this next quote illustrates, for working class children, test results have become conflated with far-reaching consequences in which good SATs results are linked to positive life prospects and poor results meant future failures and hardships. And for many of these children, test results were not simply about how well they were able to perform, but went to the very heart of who they were and what they could become. So Jackie says, our teacher's saying if we don't get good things in our SATs, when we grow up, we're not going to get good jobs. And Terry says, yeah, be plumbers and road sweepers. In The Rise of Meritocracy, Michael Young's narrator is justifying a stricter system of educational segregation by arguing that once ability can be tested and certified in children as young as 3, there's no reason to educate the bright with those who will drive down their performance. And in 21st century Britain, we've already moved a long way towards segregated state schooling, despite our so-called comprehensive system. And in the following quote, you can see the negative repercussions for working class learners of being designated a rubbish learner, only fit to go to a rubbish school. And George said, I've been hearing if you don't get into one of the good schools, they send you to one of the rubbish schools. And in school, I've been hearing everyone saying, I hope I don't go to Chiltern and stuff like that. And then I thought that was really awful because all the kids there are bad and no good at learning. And this is Typhic, who said, Deer Park's still going to be rubbish when it's changed because there's still the same students and the students are crap. But George ends up going to Chiltern and Typhic goes to Deer Park. And both have to manage the balance between going to schools seen to be rubbish and crap and trying to be successful learners. However, the processes of segregation that the ideology of meritocracy endorses and legitimates are having a wider effect beyond the negative impact on individual children. They are changing and limiting the way in which different social classes relate to each other. We now have less mixing between social classes than we've ever had over the last 50 years. And this is increasing social distance, mistrust, and ignorance of those who are different to ourselves. And in relation to the working classes, sanctioning prejudice and contempt towards them for more privileged groups. And we can see this in what the middle classes say about predominantly working class schools and the children who end up going to them. And Alex said, I wouldn't say this in front of other people, but there's no one here who's going to it. And I think Chiltern is good for the not so intelligent people, but for the intelligent people, it's not good enough. And as English schools have become more preoccupied with assessment, measurement and testing in order to separate out meritocracy's winners from the losers, a culture of hyper-competition has intensified within schools, not only between them. Now children as young as 2 and 3 are being tested and ranked on the basis of their perceived ability. And the consequences are particularly vivid in the accounts of primary age children, talking about the ability sets to which they've been allocated. and what that means for both their standing in the pupil peer group and their sense of themselves as learners. And this is a 6-year-old girl in a London primary school. And she said, the lions think they're better than us. They think they're good at every single thing. And the second group, tigers, there's some people that think they're good and more important than us. And one of the boys in giraffes, he was horrible to me. And he said, get lost, slow tortoise. But my group are monkeys and we're only second to the bottom. As well as creating hierarchies of worth among children, dividing them into winners and losers on the basis of perceived ability, meritocratic processes such as setting and streaming are also leading to children in the lower sets internalizing a sense that they have little academic value. And the quotes that I'm going to show you now are from bottom set students in an English comprehensive school. And here you can see Satvinder saying, yeah, I could have gone to a better, higher place. And then I could have done everything I was hoping to. And I said, and now? And Satvinder said, there is no hope. And then this is Attic. And he said, I'm in a proper bad set now. So I've just become rubbish. And the demoralization of bottom set children that comes through being looked down on and devalued was evident in the responses of the 4 bottom set children when I asked them whether they enjoyed their learning at school. So I said, if you had a choice, what would you choose to learn? And Jason said, nothing. George said nothing. Andy said, no idea. And Paul said, definitely nothing. 20 years ago, I wrote that the myth of meritocracy normalizes inequalities, converting them into individual rather than collective responsibilities. However, despite the cost to their self-worth and learner identities, over the last decade, working class children and young people are even more likely to identify as good neoliberal subjects, buying heavily into processes of individualization and free choice. And neoliberal influences were particularly evident in young people's espousal of aspirational discourses of having it all. So Hassim dreams of owning houses across the globe and having a fleet of cars. Shireen aims to be a leading archaeologist. Sharon's going to be a leading consultant. Cerise wants to be rich and marry a footballer, while Jiddy dreams of living in a mansion with a games room for his children and cars like Ferraris. Neoliberal attitudes also permeate their attitudes to their learning, and in particular, their powerful sense of individual responsibility for learning, and in the vast majority of cases, their failures to achieve educational success. So students told me, it's down to the individual how well you do at school. You have to make yourself stand out compared to all the other children doing the same exams. And if you want to do well, you just have to work really hard. You can't blame the school or your teachers. It's down to you. And more disturbingly, you have to be the very best of the best. These working class young people are heavily invested in notions of the autonomous, self-reliant individual, primarily responsible for any future outcomes. And throughout these quotes, I'd argue, we can see the symbolic violence that Pierre Bourdieu writes so powerfully about, being channeled through meritocratic beliefs that devalue the working classes and reinforce the privilege of the rich and powerful. And the misrecognition of educational advantage that meritocracy sanctions allows the economic, cultural, and social capitals that define educational success to be read as intrinsic ability, while the lack of those capitals is misread as inherent lack. And Bourdieu states that symbolic violence is the ability of the dominant to impose their own perceptions of themselves on others. But I would argue it also includes the ability to impose their view of the dominated on others, including the dominated themselves. And we glimpse how destructive the educational system is, premised on meritocratic competition for those who struggle, swallowed up in a remorseless system of hierarchical ranking and a competitive counting culture. And we can see the dire consequences for the individual in Jason's poignant advocacy for children like himself. And he said some children, they just can't do it. Like they find the work too hard or they can't concentrate because too much is going on for them. And then they're put like as rubbish learners and put in the bottom set, and no one cares about them, even though they're the ones who need the most help. They should be getting the most help. And schooling has become a field of everyday micro acts of symbolic violence against working class children. In 2006, 15 years after he wrote The Rise of the Meritocracy, Michael Young lamented that the British educational system, harnessed to the economy more closely than ever, had taken the heart out of millions of children as a consequence. The huge symbolic investment in a meritocratic educational system has reduced the vast majority of the working classes to collateral damage in the race for middle and upper class educational success, undermining their feelings of self-worth and damaging their sense of themselves as positive learners. However, there are losses even for the successes in this meritocratic fable that English education has become. For many bright middle and upper middle class students, reaching for the stars is not necessarily about fulfillment and satisfaction. And some children I interviewed in 2018 and 19, even those as young as 5 and 6, told me that it's not good enough to do well. You have to be the best. And in this corrosive competitive culture, being a star is no longer sufficient. So at the end of 2018, I interviewed a group of Year 1 students in a London middle-class primary school, and their sweatshirts were festooned with a range of stickers proclaiming them to be a good helper, great at listening, brilliant at making an effort, marvellous at maths, super at spelling. And there were also a range of star stickers. And when I asked one little girl what her star represented, she said, "Oh, it's nothing, it's not a particularly good star," but she was hoping to be promoted. And I asked her to explain to me. So she told me her type of star was a bit of a rubbish star, but there were shining stars that were better. And if she did really well, she might be promoted to one of these. And then another little girl in the group elaborated on the star ranking system. There were ordinary stars, then shining stars, but above them, shooting and superstars. And these girls are the winners in our educational system, but even some of them are not winning well enough. In The Rise of the Meritocracy, Michael Young mocked a system in which sons followed faithfully in the footsteps of fathers and fathers as faithfully behind grandfathers. Yet in contemporary British society, the only change to such a line of descent today is that we have daughters as well as sons following in their father's footsteps. So if we see here, only 4% of doctors, 6% of barristers, and a whopping 11% of journalists are drawn from working class backgrounds. And the most recent research I looked at showed that there are under 4% of MPs from working class backgrounds. And that's across Labour as well as Conservative. And this is unsurprising when we look at Daniel Lorison and Sam Friedman's research, which found that individuals with parents who are doctors are 24 times more likely to be doctors than those whose parents did any other type of work, while people with parents who were lawyers were 17 times more likely to go into law. But although these sons and daughters are celebrated for their industry, motivation and ability, and held up as role models for the working classes to emulate, I want to suggest that they've been socially immobile rather than mobile. The upper and middle classes want their children to find the same jobs as themselves, or if not the same job, then a slightly better job. Rather than being engaged in meritocratic processes, they are the beneficiaries of nepotism. But this nepotism and the reproduction of privilege must be hidden and presented as merit. And vivid examples of how this is accomplished are evident in Seamus Khan's book, Privilege. And he writes about how wealthy students at elite private schools in the US all portrayed their educational success as a goal that came through hard work, not from family wealth or inheritance. They all stressed how much they earned their success. Yet his research observations showed, and this is to quote from him, something quite different in the day-to-day life of their schools. Despite their verbal commitment to hard work, rarely did any of the students seem to be working. A focus on the experiences of working class children and young people reveals how the focus on meritocracy and aspiration is not progressive but reactionary. The structural conditions of a deep social, political, and economic crisis have been misdefined as a problem of individual behaviours. And the cost and cruelties of this ideological displacement are disturbingly evident in young working class students' accounts of always having to be better, to do better, and in the system's judgment that in the vast majority of cases, their efforts and strivings are not good enough. When our notion of social and economic justice starts and ends with education, it replaces other tools needed to secure economic justice. Education is being used instrumentally to justify non-redistribution through the illusion of meritocracy. Our elite appears to have convinced a majority of British citizens that they live in a meritocracy simply by espousing meritocratic rhetoric, rather than engaging in any meritocratic practices. It seems incredible when we examine the evidence that we've come to this situation. Meritocracy is a fallacy on a number of different levels. It confuses effort and ability with privilege, but it also confuses educational success with occupational outcomes. Yet 21st century Britain is not producing enough graduate jobs for all the graduates its universities are churning out. And the situation is set to get worse under COVID, compounded by Brexit. Rather, the real growth has been in traditional, low-skill, often low-paid jobs. There is more room at the bottom of society than at the top. Increasingly in the UK, there is no sympathy for the educational losers who are assumed to deserve their fate. We see this in the cruelty of everyday practices of testing and setting, which result in the routine labelling of the working classes as stupid, thick, and no good at learning. And beyond the classroom, in the designation of predominantly working class schools as rubbish schools for rubbish learners. Working class children routinely experience a narrower curriculum, stricter discipline, more teaching to the test, are afforded less resources, less experienced teachers, and have more temporary teachers than their more affluent peers. And then there's this data from the National Audit Office. And it is the schools that are most deprived that are actually losing out in funding. So they're losing funding while the most advantaged schools are getting an increase in funding. A meritocratic approach to educational success and failure has very clear negative consequences for individual working class children, but it also has clear negative consequences for wider British society, increasing social divisions and encouraging the growth of mistrust, prejudice, envy, resentment, and contempt between different social groups. And these differences and divisions, particularly those of class and race, were dramatically brought to light in the recent Brexit vote. Britain's pretense of being a meritocracy has had a dire impact on the most vulnerable groups in society, the poor, ethnic minorities, and the working classes, allowing levels of contempt and disrespect that would have been viewed as socially unacceptable in many other rich nations. And recent research found that highly educated groups in the UK are biased against those with low education, blaming them for their own low levels of education and expressing dislike and a degree of anger towards them. The privileged also drew on meritocratic ideology to reinforce assumptions about their own superior intelligence and culture. And the authors of the research concluded negative attitudes to those with few educational qualifications have become one of the last areas of acceptable prejudice, to the extent that it may not be seen by many as prejudice at all, and that these views are shared in important respects by the target group themselves. Educational losers feel that they don't deserve the same level of respect and recognition according to those who are highly educated. And this is a toxic working of meritocracy, which positions educational failure as a failure of the individual rather than the responsibility of wider society, in particular those with power. Thus, meritocracy's beneficiaries, predominantly the already successful and privileged, feel justified in looking down, disliking, and expressing contempt for those who've not been given the opportunity to succeed that they've had, writing them off as responsible for their own lack of educational failure, while their own practices remain unscrutinised. And we've seen a gradual disenfranchisement of the working classes, with more and more of them being disengaged and disaffected to the extent of not even bothering to vote. They no longer have their own people to represent them. Brexit, however, as we saw, provided a unique opportunity for meritocracies left behind to express their anger and antipathy about this situation. And I want to end with a quote from Michael Young again. And just to say that, that we need to develop a society more than ever in which all citizens have equal opportunity to develop their own special capabilities to lead a rich life. And this fair society will be founded on plural values, seeing worth far beyond the equation of ability plus effort equals merit. It would recognise the enormous barriers to academic success and that they are insurmountable for many in society as it currently is constituted economically and socially. So Michael Young wrote, schools would not segregate the like, but mingle the unlike. By promoting diversity within unity, they would teach respect for the infinite human differences, which are not the least of mankind's virtues. Schools would not regard children as shaped once and for all by nature, but as a combination of potentials that can be cultivated by nurture. An inclusive society would need a much more inclusive conception of merit than the one we have, one that encompasses practical as well as academic skills, but also creativity, caring, compassion, and collegiality. But in an austerity-scarred Britain, riven apart by social inequalities and the COVID pandemic, we are still very, very far from that. Thank you for listening to me.
Wow, that was fantastic, Diane. Yeah, kind of an amazing critique. So what I'd like to do now is open up the session to colleagues to ask questions in relation to your talk, and hopefully, and I kind of suspect from that, a few discussions will emerge. So feel free to kind of use your kind of wavy hand function. I know that different institutions use different approaches to this, but we kind of invite colleagues to actually ask their own questions. Of course, the chat function is there, but you know, feel free to kind of come in and ask a question. So who wants to kind of go first? Okay, then, well, I'm going to abuse my... Oh, Fiona, was that a wave of a hand?
Ask questions.
Hi. Hello, I'm Fiona Harvey. I'm from, I'm actually at UCL at the moment.
Yeah.
But I'm actually very interested in commuter students and their access to digital technology and how that impacts on their success. And so I've read a few of your books, and I'm very, very interested in meritocracy as this ideal thing that does not exist. But I was just wondering that this rise in mental health issues with students and this pressure that's on them from day one, I mean, it must have something to do with all of this, but also what can we do? What can we do to change this? What can we do to, because it clearly starts right at the beginning of school. It's not, by the time to get to university, there's a lot already to unpick. I just wonder what kind of initiatives and things can we do, actively do now, even if it's just politically to take action and write to our MPs. You know, I feel like there's lots of hobbyist ideas about being political at the moment, because people will complain. It's easy to complain on Twitter and agree and like things, but I feel that there's probably about now is time to do something about it.
Yeah, the thing for me is that it's difficult to suggest changes in relation to individual policies. I think what we need is a radical transformation of our education system. I mean, I'm doing lots of talks to union groups, and I think it's really hard, because I think teachers in schools have been really deprofessionalized. And the latest ITT changes are about making them sort of basically teaching technicians. And so the government is pushing through policies which are going to make the situation worse rather than better. So how do we counter that? So, I mean, I've always say to any group, it's really important to join your union and enhance the people power of the NEU, because they're quite clear what the problems are, but it's so difficult for individual teachers to change anything. I mean, I was doing research before COVID, and I was talking to the children about the behaviour systems. They've got these awful star charts in the classroom. I don't know if you've seen, they're like a traffic light system, and you can be in a red warning zone, you know, although you can move up to the caution, and then you're in a green ready to go, and then only one person can be in the stratosphere, which is this sort of superstar. It's horrible. It's horrible. And I was interviewing these 5-year-olds, and this little girl, I asked her, well, how would you describe this system? And she said torture. And I then had to give some feedback to the class teacher. And I said to the teacher, well, the children don't really like it. It's not really incentivizing them. It's demotivating them. And she cried. Oh. And I just felt awful. But I mean, and she said, but what can I do? You know, this is a system I'm having to work with. And she was having to move children up and down in reading groups based on their phonics tests. Now, as someone who's trained as a primary school teacher, I know that, you know, children's reading ability isn't down to their ability to decode a phonics blend. I mean, she knew it was a nonsense. But I just think there needs to be far more coming together. Collectively.
We're very separate now. Every angle, every aspect of what we do in a society is separating us, isn't it? It's very much even going back to your Tesco's club card, you know, you get points as an individual, you know, you build up these things. I don't know. I just feel like raising awareness of it is very, very important, because I think we've sleepwalked into this, and people have just accepted it. They've managed to get by. It's all right, kind of thing, and it's not. I
don't think the right have sleepwalked into this. I think they knew when I was.
Oh yeah, I know they. Yeah.
We had the black papers. They knew what they were doing then. They knew where they wanted to get to. And actually, go back to those really right-wing ideological papers written at the time, and they achieved nearly all of what they set out to achieve.
Yeah, no, you're right. Sorry, I meant that, you know, unaware people have sort of slept, you know, we've been conned, kind of thing. Yeah. No, thank you.
Well, thanks for asking the question.
Thanks for that. So we have a question that's been posed by Caroline Boreham. Do you want to verbalize and ask your question, or would you like me to kind of read it out? It's up to you, Caroline.
No, I'm absolutely fine. Hi, Dan. That was really, really interesting. I'm in the third year of doing my EdD, and I'm looking at using Bourdieu's lens to look at cultural capital acquisition in secondary schools. I work for a multi-academy trust that is trying to put policy into practice. But one of the recent comments on my second year proposal was, you know, it looks like you've already made up your mind about this, that, you know, education has limited potential as an engine of social mobility. And the reflection I had was, I do think that's what I think, you know, and some of that is my own experience as a, you know, free school meal child. And it resonated when you said earlier about feeling like a fish out of water professionally and you know, navigating kind of strange social conventions and things I'm not used to. So it's just any tips on how I try and be objective, how I try and, you know, have a really solid literature review, but still being true to what I think.
I really empathise, because it's a situation I've been in all my academic career. Because I have very strong views about inequality. I think it's totally unacceptable and cruel, and that it needs to be challenged. But what happens is that the people who are pumping out the neoliberal ideology, the people who are promoting meritocracy and saying we've got masses of social mobility, actually, we have got quite a lot of social mobility. Most of it's going downwards now. So those people don't have to evidence themselves. You know, they just have to trot out those things as part of a common popular discourse. So I would say that the most important thing is to draw on lots of quantitative evidence and data, and there is masses of it. I've just sent an email to a professor in Harvard saying, thank God for your work, because it's brilliant, because mine is all ethnographic, qualitative, small scale. And he's got huge data sets, brilliant stuff on social mobility and inequality. And I've learned the hard way that, you know, if I'm going to say something that comes through the data, and I'm trying to talk about habitus or cultural capital, that the way to, that actually it should stand on its own, but it's never seen to by the people who are judging our work. And so I always juxtapose it with the quantitative data and the statistics, which is what I did throughout my book, Miseducation, because I just knew that if you can have spent, I mean, I've done thousands of interviews now, well, nearly 2,000 interviews with young people and children in schools, but it's never seemed to count as much.
That's really useful. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Diane. We have a hand wave from Sarah Weiner. So,
hi, Diane. Hi, thanks, Craig. Thanks for I love your work. I love your talk. Thank you very much. I'm just kind of curious as to what extent we replicate a lot of these stuff in the way that we teach at university and the way that we the academic excellence is judged in a particular way. You've got to meet those particular standards, right, in that particular way, have your journal articles, set out, otherwise you're criticised and you get little badges like, I'm in the ref or I'm an excellent teacher or you know,
Start.
and how we then pass them on to our students who, you know, expect to write in a particular way, in, you know, using words which, to be quite honest, you know, when I've been reading academic articles, I've had to go and look up, you know, and I come from a family who, you know, ended up in academia, or, you know, a mum who did. So, you know, how can we try and address that? I mean, I teach in education studies, and so we can talk about it quite a lot there, but just in terms of our pedagogic practice, how can we do it? I can see Craig laughing there, because, you know, we do it, and it's really uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah. I think collaborations, collegiality, the best time I had in academia was when I was a member of FAB, Feminists Against Academic Bollocks. And we did I think we did BERA. We certainly did the AERA. We went off and we put in what seemed to be a conventional abstract, and then we took the piss out of academic competition and hierarchy and its masculinity. So actually, but finding fellow, you know, people who are on the same wavelength as you, and that might not be within the same university, but across universities, because we were a group of 6 women, all in different institutions, some in new universities, some in older ones, but we had a really wonderful time, and that allowed us, and we did sketches on the ref, just taking the piss out of it, basically, and that you had a sense of being supported, of being able to rise above the sort of nasty, sort of individualized hyper competition that academia has become through that process. So I think support groups and networks are really important if you can find like-minded people.
So then the question is how do we kind of talk about that with some of our students? There's a student I'm working with on a student academic journal at the moment, and he's done brilliantly at John Moores, and he's talking about going and doing his masters at Cambridge, because all his mates have gone to red brick universities, and it's a better kind of education, and I get how we can work together. I get that, and how you can do that. I mean, I do it through political stuff as well, and whatnot. But it's how we kind of try and persuade our students that they can be with us and they don't have to be bog standard academic, you know.
I think it's really, I mean, that's another myth, isn't it? The academic hierarchy. I mean, when I started off at South Bank and then went to King's College and then went to London Met before I ended up in Cambridge. And when I got there, they said, oh, you don't have to worry now, you know, you've proved yourself. Everyone here is the best of the brightest. They have this fantasy about themselves, but having had a lot of experience in schools, another career, and then moved into academia in my mid-40s, I wasn't, you know, I got enough experience not to be taken in by it. And actually, it was quite clear that on some levels, the students were far less informed, far more ignorant, not anything like as bright as a lot of the students I taught at London Met. And that's what worries me. So many of us buy into this Oxbridge excellence myth, particularly the people who are there themselves. And it's another fantasy. I mean, look at the people it's produced. You know, Boris went there. So did most of his cabinet. I mean, it's obvious it's not producing the best and the brightest.
Thank you. I do think that we really need to kind of work on it at the School of Education. I can't speak for everywhere. Our School of Education is actually really having a look at what we consider to be academically excellent, and not just kind of refusing to give people a 2-1 because they haven't used the right Harvard referencing, for example, or, you know, not used the correct connectives, or yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we have a question that's been posed in the chat by Glenn, which I kind of missed briefly. And it kind of links into what I'm interested in as well. So it kind of sprang to mind for me. So Glenn, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah. Hi, Craig. Hi, Diane.
Hello.
Thank you so much for that, Diane. Really appreciate it. Funnily enough, Craig was involved in my progression Viva last year, and you very kindly recently agreed to do my final Viva, Diane, which I'm really appreciative of. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think when I came into this, having become really disheartened working within secondary schools with the whole culture, and obviously the neoliberal policies, how they impact upon schools and unethical leadership, that kind of thing. So I became really disheartened, really. When I started my research, I think perhaps naively, the intent was that, I could sort of come up with something that might be transformative in some way and make a real difference. But I think the more I look into it and the more that I see that actually, structurally the inequalities are so entrenched and embedded that, I can't foresee any future really where the system becomes more equal. And I just wondered if you thought that within the current system, particularly, you mentioned other countries like Scandinavian countries where things are more equal and where meritocracy at least stands a chance. Is it ever going to be a situation where social mobility is going to be possible within this country? And if so, what needs to happen, would you say, Diane?
I mean, I think the two countries I've been looking at closely, I mean, I was a visiting professor in Finland for a long time, but I've also been looking at Estonia, which has just been awarded the best education system in the world award, because they actually looked to Finland and looked what Finland had done right. And then, but both those countries have a very small gap between the rich and the poor. So I would always say that, the education system can't transform society. Bernstein said that, 50 years ago. We need serious redistribution in order to ensure that people aren't living in poverty, and that we're taxing the wealthy, that we have a wealth tax. And then when the economic, social, cultural hierarchy in our society is less steep, then it's possible to get the education system to do some really progressive work. But I don't think it's possible when we've got an enormous and growing, that the gap between the rich and the poor in this country is set to grow. We've just, refused, we've taken away that £20, but we should be campaigning for a minimum wage of £15 an hour, and yet our party's agreeing to, what is it, 10, 11? I mean, we need to really, really do something to decrease that enormous and growing gap between the rich and the poor before we can actually do a lot with our education system to enable that to, enhance the life chances of all children, not just a few.
Yeah, I would agree entirely with that, Diane. I think, interestingly, some of the things that you spoke about really resonated with the research I'm doing at the moment in my hometown of Blackpool, which, is things are really, really difficult. And some of the people I've been speaking to within areas of education, but also public health and social care, talk about there not being a joined up approach. They talk about all the pressure being on the fact that the belief is that schools can fix all social ills, when cuts to social care and cuts to public health have meant that actually schools are having to do a lot more for a lot less funding, and the situation is quite desperate. I mean,
I'm still in contact with a lot of teachers I talk with, and there's one of my ex-colleagues is now a head teacher in the northwest, and she has 7 buckets collecting rainfall when there's a downpour. I mean, that her infrastructure is appalling, And she's set to lose money under the latest Tory funding proposals.
Yeah, thank you, Diane.
But there's a few kind of comments and links to articles being posted in the chat function, which kind of relate to imposter syndrome. It kind of, as I've kind of got the oversight, you know, this seems to be something that's kind of piquing quite a number of people's interest. And one of the guests called Hina, and I do know Hina, I just wonder if Hina wants to maybe come in and say a few words about this kind of imposter syndrome and kind of her journey so far. I realise that's putting you on the spot, Hina, so if you'd prefer not to, then that's fine. But if you're still here and you do want to kind of say a few words, then feel free to come in. I'll take that as a no. But it is, you know, this kind of whole problem of imposter syndrome, and I think it's Caroline Jackson from Lancaster has posted an article saying that with the title "Stop Telling Women That they have imposter syndrome." You know, so it kind of, I think it's pausing the argument to kind of challenge using the term, the notion. Just wondered what your thoughts were on, you know, this kind of, you know, the issue or the problems associated with imposter syndrome, Diane.
I mean, yeah, I think it's quite difficult moving into a field that's very, very socially cultural different from the one you've grown up in. I think it's more difficult if you move into a field where those people think they're culturally, intellectually and socially superior to you. I mean, I actually went straight from working class mining community at 18 to a Russell Group university, and I think I hadn't really had any contact with the middle classes until then. And it was a total shock to my system. But it's interesting because, I mean, I done extremely well academically. You know, I'd worked really, really, really hard. And I felt, you know, that I deserved to be there. And yet it was quite clear that other people felt that I didn't. Mm-hmm. It was very interesting, at the end of the first year exams, because a public school boy whose father had an estate, he was that rich, said I wasn't to worry if I failed my end of year exams because his father would give me a job on the estate. And then the glorious thing was that this rich public school boy, he was the one who failed the end of year exams, and so he got thrown out, not me. But I mean, I think it's difficult. I think that too much is invested in the individual moving into a different field. It's the same with gender. Mm-hmm. And actually, the problem is with the people policing that field, be it the middle classes, the upper classes, or white people or men. You know, they're the people who need to change.
Yeah, I mean, because I can kind of relate to that in so many ways, because I came from and have a heritage, you know, kind of very working class background. So I grew up in Blackburn, you know, amongst the dilapidated, you know, mills, etc. And the whole notion of university and higher education, it wasn't even part of the discourse within the family. So I kind of joined the army straight from school. And then that didn't sit comfortably with me for some reason. And then I became a weaver in a factory for kind of 5 years after that. And then I kind of returned to education in my kind of mid-20s. And then it was this kind of uphill struggle, you know, to become part of this culture that was really quite strange and alien.
Yeah.
You know, so that, you know. Yeah, sorry, go on.
The most recent research I've been doing is saying, look, hold on, we've looked at the working class individual too much and talked about their anxiety, their lack of confidence, their lack of entitlement. Actually, we need to stop doing that and look at the overconfidence, the inflated sense of entitlement, the superiority of those people with the power in these elite fields. And there needs to be institutional cultural change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of expecting that the working class person entering this field to do all the work on themselves. For God's sake, we've had to do so much work on ourselves to get there in the first place. The people causing all the problems in society aren't doing anything to change themselves.
Absolutely. Right, we have another hand wave, so it's from Carolyn Jackson. So Carolyn, do you want to kind of pop in and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. That was great, Diane. Thanks so much. Really excellent, and thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. It was just about the imposter syndrome comment, really. I mean, I think it fits really nicely with what you've talked about, Diane, because my impression of the critique of imposter syndrome is that it very much individualizes it and suggests that it is a problem of the individual woman or black person or whatever, and that's the notion, and that's what we should be challenging, that it's actually trying to understand the structural inequalities that make people feel that way. So I think it fits very much with what you're saying, and it's not an individual failing. I mean, I'm sure people, I certainly do, relate to the feelings that have been described as imposter syndrome, but it's reconceptualizing it, I think. So.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, and thanks for the article, because I think, for too long I did focus on, what was going on for the working class person in a frightening, unfamiliar field, and I sort of, about 5 years ago, I thought this shouldn't be the focus. We should be looking at those gatekeepers. They're the ones who need to change.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's Catherine's article, so she probably knows more. I'm sure she knows more about it than I do. But yeah, great, and thanks for the discussion. It's a really good session.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. So Hina has now raised a hand. So Hina, feel free to come in and either, ask your question or comment. Are you there? Maybe not. I'll just check the. No. It can't seem to unmute. I'll just see if I can tweak that. Just 1 sec. No, that's odd. I can't seem to change that.
But can I just say, my focus is on social class, but as Caroline said, it's an issue of gender, but also race too. And what has shocked me in relation to Cambridge more than anything, I think, is the fact that they expect that they're trying to recruit a much more diverse ethnic intake. And yet, when they get there, they're young, black, ethnically diverse students who expect to do all the work on themselves.
Yeah.
The institution just, standing back and saying how progressive and wonderful we are. Look at our growing ethnic diversity. And when they are clearly institutionally racist.
Yeah. Right, I will just check. I think any more questions? Right, there's a couple of people that have asked about your slides. So could you kind of send a copy of those by email?
Michael's got a copy of the slides, so you're very welcome to use them however you want. Yeah.
Perfect. Right, I'll just have a kind of one last call. Any kind of final comments or questions that you'd like to kind of pose or raise for? Just a comment there from Fiona just saying it's a good point about bringing people into university and then dropping them off without any real support. Again, the kind of, the existing culture makes no effort to kind of adapt or change. It's like, you want to come here, then you need to become one of those.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Right. Well, we'll leave it there. So kind of many thanks. That was an absolute great talk and fantastic question and discussion as well. So many thanks for taking time out, and also many thanks, colleagues, for coming and spending time and listening and asking questions. So yeah.
Thanks everyone.
It has been recorded, so we'll make a copy, a version. We'll make it available. So thanks again, Diane. Thanks.
Right, my pleasure. Bye-bye. Take care.